7 years ago. And it was at a time when there was a huge surge in the prominence of cognitive neuroscience. It was becoming clear that this was a science that was going to make its effects known in various different sectors of our everyday lives. And since then, and true to that surge, the landscape of neuroscience has really changed enormously. First off, there are just many, many more neuroscientists. So the memberships to professional societies like Cognitive Neuroscience Society or the Society for Neuroscience have multiplied hugely. Neuroscientists no longer look like they once did. They're not the typical white lab-coated scientist confined to traditional lab spaces. They look very, very different. They have changed roles. They've been given different roles in society. So, for example, here at the top right, you see Baroness Susan Greenfield, whose work you might know, or whose face you might know, because she's become a sort of ubiquitous presence, at least in Britain. And she's now been given the role of being a spokesperson, not about how the brain works, but about how we should live according to what we know or presume to know about the brain. So she speaks about subjects as wide-ranging as child rearing, how we should use digital technologies, education, all based in some way on evidence coming out of cognitive neuroscience. Neuroscience is they've spilt into the celebrity world. So down at the bottom, you will probably recognize the Hollywood actor Goldie Hawn. It's been interesting to watch her. She's recently been speaking about things like dopamine or brain plasticity among children in her new campaign to spread happiness around the world among children. So she's been drawing on evidence from cognitive neuroscience to talk about how meditation practices, specifically mindfulness practices, can grow the brain in certain ways that cultivates happiness. And I mentioned at the beginning that cognitive neuroscience isn't anymore confined to traditional lab spaces, but actually initiatives like citizen neuroscience are drawing amateur scientists, lay people at home to gather data, to interpret data, to get involved in designing experiments. And similarly, the initiative of Backyard Brains is bringing neuroscience to children, to other lay audiences outside of the lab in community spaces, and distributing this kind of expertise well beyond mainstream research settings. So you can see that in the last few years, in the last decade, neuroscience has certainly spilt into various different domains, and people are coming into contact with the findings and also with the languages and visual images of neuroscience much more. It's also become much more commonplace to talk publicly about the shortcomings of cognitive neuroscience. So these are just some of the titles from various popular online blogs, from newspaper articles, from popular books, scholarly books, where authors are starting to talk about the overzealousness of neuroscientists and of other commentators who've started to describe or explain phenomena as complex as our everyday emotions, the arts, culture, literature, all in terms of neural processes. And what critical neuroscience has been doing is looking empirically at what the actual aims, the methods, the goals in cognitive neuroscience are. What is the actual scope, and what are the political, the social, cultural contexts in which neuroscience research happens, and in which the findings become taken up in various other domains. So, although I just said that this kind of critical inquiry has become more common, cognitive neuroscience still really warrants this sort of social scientific analysis from outside and from within, because as you no doubt know, there are new large-scale neuroscience initiatives upon us, what with the Obama administration's recent announcement of the Brain Initiative. There's also been parallel investment in Europe with the Human Brain Project. So the basic aims of these two initiatives is to amass huge quantities of data to try to model the complex interactions between the brain and behaviors with the ultimate aims of informing neurological diagnosis of neurological disorders, psychiatric disease, and also to develop prevention initiatives. So neuroscience is continuing to expand, and a large part of these initiatives is devoted to public engagement or knowledge transfer, knowledge translation, the dissemination of the findings that are coming out of this. So these are some of the questions that critical neuroscience has been handling as these kinds of initiatives unfold. But what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is focus really on the last question, questions that neuroscientists and other commentators have asked about whether we're becoming neurological subjects. In other words, are we starting to, with all this exposure to neuroscience information, are we starting to understand ourselves in terms of the brain? So I'm not handling the philosophical question of whether in fact we are reducible to our brains, but rather with this increasing contact with dissemination initiatives like the kinds I'll show you, how is it that this is reshaping, if at all, our identities or our understanding of health, of illness, or our basic sense of personhood? So no doubt you're familiar with images like these. On the right, a brain scanner, a brain imaging machine associated with magnetic resonance imaging and also functional MRI. And next to it, images that are produced as a result of scanning people, looking at certain behaviors or looking at structures in the brain. And as many anthropologists have documented, and as you all know, there are many, many levels of manipulation, experimenter-driven manipulation and adjustment of data before arriving at these final images. They also capture certain snapshots of behavior, for example, or a certain aspect of brain structure, but they miss out a whole set of other factors, the context in which people are experiencing the phenomena that scientists are investigating, for example. So they capture something, but they capture a part of it. They tell part of a story. And as I said, they're really manipulated images. The data are adjusted in several ways. The parameters are changed. And finally, we arrive at these. But in spite of all these shortcomings or caveats, they've gained a huge amount of authority, a huge amount of power. And they are very evocative in conveying the illusion of certainty, of objectivity, the sense that various complex phenomena, whether they're our emotions, our illnesses, our sense of who we are, can be located in a very specific part of the brain or in a specific set of functions of the brain. So these ideas have been taken up by various authors in various kinds of texts. On that side, I've just pointed to a genre of neurohumanities. So this is where scholarly books are being written by humanities researchers who are describing, explaining phenomena like literature, religion, politics, aesthetics in terms of brain processes. And next to that, you'll probably be much more familiar with having seen shelf upon shelf of this ever-expanding genre of popular literature, neuro-self-help books, where authors, not necessarily, in fact, mostly not neuroscientists, are taking up neuroscience explanations or versions of neuroscience explanations to describe what they call essential differences between kinds of people. So, for example, differences between men and women, or using the brain to explain why adolescents behave the ways that they typically do, how we can intervene in our brains to change our lives, how we can use what we know about cognitive neuroscience to be more efficient, more productive, make more money, how we can tailor educational initiatives according to what we know about the male or female brain, etc. So what are some of the notions of the brain that these authors are conveying in these kinds of texts? Well, the most prevalent idea of the brain, the most prevalent metaphor or model of the brain is that of the plastic brain. So this is the idea that the brain is plastic, it's dynamic, it's malleable, and it's changing in experience-dependent ways. It matters what kinds of contexts we find ourselves in, what we put ourselves in, the environments that we're in, and by modifying these, or by being aware of these, we can also shape our brains, mold our brains, and in turn, as this author says, change our lives in multiple ways. So for obvious reasons, you can see that the idea that we can intervene and shape our dynamic brains is hugely appealing. And this has been a kind of explosive genre of popular literature. Here's another hugely successful book by Norman Doidge, which also promotes the science of the plastic brain and various interventions into the brain. Just to read a part of his text, the neuroplastic revolution has implications for, among other things, our understanding of how love, sex, grief, relationships, learning, addictions, culture, technologies, and psychotherapies change our brains. So another recently emerging model of the brain is that of the connectome. So this refers to the idea that the brain is a mass of vastly connected networks of neurons. And this is how some people have come to understand the brain. And this is an image taken from MIT researcher Sebastian Seung's TED Talk, where he's advocating the idea that we are our connectomes. And he's written a book. The subtitle goes, How the Brain's Wiring Makes Us Who We Are. So I said that with initiatives like the Brain Initiative or the Human Brain Project come imperatives from funding agencies, from universities to disseminate this kind of knowledge. Also, as these kinds of models of the brain emerge out of cognitive neuroscience research, there's an enormous push to engage the public, engage various patient populations, lay audiences, young people, children, in knowledge about the brain, in understanding exactly things like this, that our brains are connectomes, are plastic, and so on. So how is it that people are actually taking up this kind of information? Because there have been different voices. Some people within the neuroscience community saying that it's crucial that as we enter an increasingly neurobiological age, it's important for people to be able to have some kind of neuroscientific literacy, to make more informed decisions about their treatment choices, to have a better grasp on their conditions, on their illnesses, on their basic sense of who they are. And then there have been cynics who've said that these big drives in public engagement are simply justify expanding research agendas, and probably more worryingly, that pushing this kind of literacy onto different audiences risks subordinating other kinds of knowledge that people hold already that explain their illnesses or that help them to understand their conditions, that neuroscience information will somehow depoliticize their circumstances by locating the origin of their behaviors, of their distress, inside the brain. So it's important to look empirically at how people who are coming into contact with it, actually making sense of it. And there's been some interesting work. This is a photo from work that a British anthropologist, Simon Cohn, has been doing. So he's been talking to patients and volunteers involved in neuroimaging studies who are coming into contact. Usually you take part in a study and you get to take away a picture of your brain. And he's asked people about how they understand these images. So this person says, this picture, this is the most accurate portrait you can ever get. It's a picture of who you really are on the inside. I tell people it's my self-portrait. So other people in this study showed that similarly, people tend to give, at least in this study, images of the brain a very important status. So others talked about framing these pictures and hanging them up in prominent places in their living rooms. Others talked about cutting them out and putting them in their wallets or their purses amongst pictures of their grandchildren and children. There was a huge status given to these images. And that points to a growing neurorealism, to use a term that Montreal neuroethicist Eric Racine has used to describe the belief in the truth of these brain images, and correspondingly an increase in neuroessentialism, the idea that we can equate our subjectivities, our sense of selfhood, with language or images of the brain. But looking at various audiences, you'll see that the findings really aren't that consistent. People take this up in different ways. So this is from work done by a sociologist, Scott Vrecko, who's been studying online blogs and discussion forums of people who identify as addicts, as alcoholics. So to quote Sophia, one of the online bloggers, "I'm not an alcoholic, I'm endorphin challenged. I do love the phrase endorphin challenged because that's exactly what I am." So you can see that some people, and in this study it showed that these people with alcoholism very readily adopted the language of the brain. Why might that be? The analysis in this was probably because it shifts a sense of responsibility, a moral weight. When we talk about having a condition that's located, the source of the condition is located in the brain, there's a transfer from I am an alcoholic and the weight of that to I have a condition. So somehow the brain here is serving as a substrate for a kind of moral innocence, which explains why these people most likely were readily adopting the vocabulary of the brain. But work that I've done with typically developing adolescents in the UK points to a really different picture. So I was speaking to young people, no diagnosis, young people who've been exposed to a huge amount of neuroscience education. So this was in the UK, where there's been a very big drive to educate young people about the brain, but specifically about their brains, about what it is in the developing brain that explains behaviors typically associated in certain contexts with adolescence, like distractedness or risk-taking and so on. So people that I spoke to had visited exhibitions, they'd had curriculum materials exposed to them, they'd had visits from scientists working on the model of the teen brain, and they'd learnt a little bit about neuroplasticity, the idea that their brains are developing and that this was somehow responsible for certain behaviors manifest among adolescents as a group. But what I found was that these teenagers displayed real resistance to the language of the brain. So here's Kate, one of the focus group members, who said, "I wouldn't take the brain as an excuse for behaviors. It's not that you can say, oh, it's not my fault, it's my brain. You should be taking it into your own hands rather than saying, I can't help it." So this suggests that people who do resist the language of the brain do so probably because neurobiological language has multiple moral effects. So in this case, by placing the source of a behavior, not an illness, just a behavior or an attribute in the brain, or describing it in terms of plasticity, makes the problem seem more intractable, makes the person feel or seem more inherently or intrinsically problematic and stigmatized. So adolescents here insisted that the model of the teen brain didn't capture the full complexity of who they felt they were. It homogenized them, it negatively stereotyped them, and it framed them as a group of people defined by neuroscience as inevitably distracted or inevitably driven to propensities like risk-taking and in need of intervention by way of their plastic brains. A third case study is that of people who identify as autistic self-advocates. This is a highly politicized group who've mobilized themselves online and in non-virtual spheres from the neurodiversity group. And if you're not familiar with neurodiversity, it's a movement that emerged in the 90s. And the idea was to promote the idea that autism is a human specificity that should be respected and not treated, respected like other human specificities like race or gender, sexuality, and autism was just the same. And they've been really interesting. There's been a lot of interesting social science work done with this group, and you can see from this quotation by Muskie, "My brain is a jewel," that people in this group tend to embrace the language of the brain quite wholeheartedly. And they do so because the language of the brain gives weight, it lends weight to the idea that this is a very specific group of people, different from non-autistic people. So these self-advocates are keen to distinguish themselves from who they term neurotypicals, so non-autistic people, and using the latest in brain science legitimizes this difference and gives it a sort of scientific basis for their specificity and in some cases for their superiority. So again, you can see here people taking up neuroscience language in different ways. And in this case, by taking up the language of the brain, it by no means equates with taking up the idea that autism is a problem, a disorder. In fact, quite the opposite. The language of the brain allows them to make this equivalent to other kinds of human differences, but rejecting the idea that it's any sense of a disorder. So a lot of the work that's been done with by social scientists have shown that interviewees in studies like this use neuroscience to critique or distance themselves from the more morally responsibilizing discourses of previous models like psychoanalysis. And neuroscience allows them to have a more empowered understanding of what autism is. So this is an interesting group to follow online. So yeah, from these different case studies, you can see that people tend to take up or reject language of the brain, ideas from neuroscience in very different ways. I should also remind you that people who do embrace the language of the brain do so from within a context in which biomedical evidence. Sorry, how long have I got? I'm rounding up. They do so from a context in which biomedical evidence is really favored. So talking about things, talking about conditions, circumstances in terms of the brain has very real consequences like insurance, disability facilities, certain kinds of education. I've put this study up here just to recap on some of the ways that ideas about the brain are conveyed in the media. This is a study published fairly recently. It's an analysis of about 3,000 articles published in the British press over a decade from 2000. And the authors analyzed all these media articles and thematized them in three different ways that sort of map on to the case studies that I just presented. I hope you'll be able to see that. The first is the idea that the brain is capital, that we can optimize the brain. And this fits neatly with the idea of the plastic brain. So if the brain is malleable, it's changeable depending on the context that we're in, the environments that we're in, it's also amenable to intervention, to optimization and enhancement. And certain groups like adolescents are particularly susceptible to being discussed in this way as people as a whole in need of brain optimization based on this idea of plasticity. The second theme is the idea that the brain is an index of difference. You could see that, I hope, in the slide showing the pictures of popular texts, and in these case studies as well, that the visual images, the information, the data coming out of neuroscience is often used to essentialize differences between kinds of people, men and women, and in these examples, addicts and non-addicts, adolescents and adults, certainly autistic people from non-autistic people. And then finally, the idea that the brain is biological proof. So to see something in the brain or to understand it in terms of the brain is to believe in the reality of that emotion or the illness or the sense of self. I'm just got a couple more. It's important to remember that the kind of neuroscience that's being circulated and being taken up is often based on preliminary findings. It's knowledge that's subject to change. And it's also important to remember that the very notions of the brain, whether it's the idea of the plastic brain or the connectome, these are all highly historically and culturally contingent. They depend on societal developments, technological developments in any given moment. So many scholars have said that it's no coincidence that we understand the brain presently as a flexible network of connections because of certain societal and technological developments. At this particular historical moment, our interests in connection, in social cognition, or within a flexible network economy. In other words, how we view the brain, our models of the brain, are contingent upon certain ideas in the background, floating around at any particular moment. So an interesting question is, if these dissemination drives also included a more critical or nuanced education about neuroscience and its political and cultural context, what would the implications then be of how people respond to neuroscientific information? So as these initiatives continue to unfold, to expand, it's important that we keep talking to people who are being defined or exposed to neuroscientific information. I mentioned that some people are very enthusiastic about spreading the word about neuroscience and educating people. Others are concerned of its depoliticizing, its stigmatizing effects. There's been an interesting study published just a few months ago by an Australian group that showed that actually a certain amount of exposure to neuroscience education or information can be what they called protective. In other words, people who'd had some information about neuroscience, some kind of education, came to other types of models, like models of addiction that were described in terms of the brain, in slightly more critically informed ways than people who'd had no exposure to neuroscience information whatsoever, who were more likely to allow it to supplant pre-existing ideas of selfhood, of health, illness, and be more passive to it. So it's an open question as we start these or continue these knowledge translation drives, how different people will take this up and what educating or engaging people in neuroscience actually does. So I'm just going to end with leaving some questions up here of what critical neuroscience continues to grapple with as these initiatives expand, and focus really on the last point here in saying that I hope you'll see that some of these findings from these case studies show that contrary to the expectation, the worry even, that neuroscience is such a powerful body of knowledge that's supplanting other forms of knowledge and taking over, depoliticizing, stigmatizing people based on this kind of language. Actually, in many ways, it's really not. It's being rejected. It's being reconciled with pre-existing notions of self. In some cases, of course, it is having that seductive power. It is very authoritative. But in most cases, as the sociologist in Scotland, Martin Pickersgill, has termed it, it exists, the brain exists as an object of mundane significance. It's there as a kind of tacit knowledge in amongst other kinds of information, other kinds of psychological knowledge, or other forms of or other ideas that people hold to think about their circumstances or their health conditions. And people tend to act as bricoleurs, picking and choosing different forms of information to suit their own circumstances based on their own political, economic, and social contexts. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Did I go on too much?
Thank you, Suparna, for an excellent talk. Questions? Yes.
It was interesting. First of all, I really enjoyed the talk. But second of all, the quote from the teenager that you posted, it sort of struck me that teenagers are a little bit older and they have this ability to sort of push back when they're actively forming an identity. Do you have speculations on, say, children in psychiatry who are fed a certain narrative about the brain and how that affects their development of an identity, whether or not they're able to push back in the same way or have the same critical thought about what they're being told?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's work actually that we're doing here at the moment, looking at how this kind of vocabulary is folded into these psychiatric encounters. And it seems in tune with what I was saying towards the end, that there's a kind of syncretism. People take up different vocabularies. The language of the brain tends to function as a metaphor most of the time. Even clinicians don't use it accurate to how neuroscientists would talk about the brain. I haven't seen people necessarily push back, but people don't tend to take, in psychiatric contexts, the brain at face value or to get rid of other ways of talking about themselves in favor of the brain. And they sort of incorporate it into other ways of talking about getting better, recovery, or growing up. It's used by clinicians as a metaphor to help people through the treatment process. I haven't seen people rejecting it, but what I haven't seen is that there's a kind of wholehearted acceptance, or that suddenly people are understanding themselves in very mechanistic or reductionist ways. Again, there's a kind of weaving in of this language with ways that people already talk about themselves to understand their conditions.
Other question? Yes, sir.
So neuroscience in general now involves many complex techniques that are, there's a wide variety of them. And neuroscientists in general are becoming expert in one technique, which make it that much harder to interpret data or to understand data from a neuroscientist using a different technique, because you're an expert in your own technique, but you're not an expert in everybody else's technique. So how much do you think this has an influence on how we explain data, or how we interpret data, or explain our models to journalists, for example, or to the media, or to...
Yeah, I'm sure it does have an effect. I mean, I was under the impression also that now to be a neuroscientist, one has to be skilled at coding, for example. Am I right that now there's so much sort of computational modeling that becomes a huge part of doing neuroscience research, which is kind of mystifying to most lay people. So I imagine, yeah, the expertise and the level of complexity means that certain ideas about the brain become oversimplified, if that's what you mean, in communicating to the media. But yeah, methods tend not to be very well specified in media representation of neuroscience. It's usually broad ideas of models of the brain. Imaging tends to get most of the attention. That's MRI and functional MRI. I don't see that much, for example, in that study in Neuron, of the media representations about, say, EEG or other kinds of methodologies. Functional imaging has this appeal because it seems so easy to understand, even if imagers would say that there's a whole lot of manipulation and expertise that's required to interpret those data. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, I guess it's a very right question, but I see it as a big problem where I'm doing neuroimaging, but I have colleagues using animal models, for example.
Right.
And we're talking about the same thing, but it's very difficult for me to understand what exactly is a model that they're applying and how it informs the model that I'm using to explain. We're talking about similar phenomenon, but it's very difficult to grasp like at what level we're talking about and how to communicate between us. And I can see how for journalists it becomes that much harder to explain to the public how to
Absolutely.
what to make up of it.
One more question before we break. Yes, girl.
There have been other concepts that have been propagated and popularized and used to explain human behavior. And so one was, as I was looking at your slide of Obama and his brain project, I'm reminded of the Human Genome Project.
Yeah.
So that was one, that genetics was going to explain all psychiatric, mental kind of problems. Another one is sort of evolutionary theories. That's one of the favorites to draw on to explain psychiatric problems. So I'm wondering how this compares and situates with respect to these other concepts that over time have risen and fallen in their popularity.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Actually, I've been doing some work recently comparing the rhetoric around the Human Genome Project and the Brain Initiative. And you can see with words like connectome, the analogy with the genome, and certainly in the way that the Brain Initiative has been promoted, there's a lot of, there's constant referencing to the sort of symbolic importance of the genome in understanding who we are. But of course, the Human Genome Project didn't yield that much that's been taken up in medicine compared to what the rhetoric around it was. So, of course, a lot of commentators who are studying the beginning of the Brain Initiative are forecasting similar things, that there aren't very clear hypotheses at the moment. There's a lot of searching for data less clear than the Human Genome Project. So I can only say that the neuroscience never stops drawing on evolutionary theory, and in some ways there are parallels with the Human Genome Project, but I guess time will tell with the unfolding of the Human Brain Project and the Brain Initiative, whether there's a similar rise and plateauing. I certainly see a change of how people are responding with sort of less uncritical enthusiasm to cognitive neuroscience as it's become more possible to speak openly about methodological shortcomings, for example, within and outside the neuroscience community. So hopefully that sort of tempered the momentum of cognitive neuroscience a little bit, but we'll see.
Well, thank you, Suparna.